One closed door, two faint pink lines, and in under 60 seconds, Alara's carefully constructed life didn't just crumble, it detonated. What Marcus did next, the man who had sworn forever with eyes full of laughter and promises as sweet as summer wine, will leave you breathless. You think you've seen betrayal? You haven't heard Alara's story. Because this isn't just another tale of a woman scorned. This is the unbelievable, raw account of how hitting rock bottom can be the most terrifying, yet ultimately powerful, launchpad imaginable. And yet, this isn't just a story of despair. Stick with me for just the next few moments, and you'll discover the one, almost imperceptible decision she made that began to turn her darkest hour, a midnight of the soul, into what would eventually become a $1 million dawn. How does a woman, left with absolutely nothing but a secret melody of life growing within her and a future she never ever asked for, even begin to fight back? And what about that tiny, almost insignificant wooden bird charm he left behind on the nightstand? A careless oversight or a deliberate cruel enigma? Could that forgotten trinket hold a secret, a key to a future he so casually tried to erase? Don't even think about looking away, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see your own struggles. This is the kind of story that reminds you that sometimes the most devastating endings are just the universe's brutal way of forcing you into an extraordinary new beginning. Alara had always been the quiet type, the kind of girl who found solace in the rustle of book pages and the silent symphony of her own thoughts. Her dreams were modest, like her nature. A small cafe, a haven filled with the aroma of cinnamon, the murmur of soft jazz, and the comforting presence of well-loved books. A place where people could pause, breathe, and feel like they belonged. Then came Marcus. He wasn't a thunderclap. He was a slow, intoxicating melody. Funny, charming, with a laugh that could make a room full of strangers feel like old friends. He'd stepped into the print shop where Alara worked one rainy afternoon, drenched and fuming over a messed-up order. She'd offered him a tissue, a small, hesitant smile. That was how it started. Coffee dates bled into long walks, shared secrets under starry skies, slow Sunday mornings tangled in sheets and soft promises. He wasn't perfect, she knew that. But then again, neither was she. They found something in each other, or so she believed, a fragile sense of home. For the first time, Alara dared to imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, but about something truly worth living for. What she didn't know, what no one ever truly knows, is that every calm carries the seed of a storm. Hers arrived with a late period and a test stick that trembled in her hand, two pink lines. Stark. Undeniable. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild, trapped bird, drowning out the entire world. Pregnant. She placed a hand over her still flat stomach, a sudden, sacred awareness blooming amidst the terror. This was real. She waited for Marcus to come home, the seconds stretching into elastic hours, each tick of the clock a tiny hammer blow against her hope. He was late. Again, when he finally walked in, smelling faintly of stale beer and someone else's perfume, she tried to speak, but her voice was a fractured whisper. Marcus, I'm pregnant. He blinked, just blinked. No joy illuminated his face, no shock, not even anger. Just a sudden chilling emptiness, a shudder falling behind his eyes. The silence that followed was a physical weight, pressing the air from her lungs. Then the words that would become the anthem of her desolation. Wow, that's big. He paused, a small, almost indifferent shrug. Not good, not bad, just big. That was it. That was all he gave her. No embrace, no questions, no shared fear or tentative excitement. Just big. In the days that followed, an invisible wall rose between them, brick by silent brick. He didn't bring it up again. He still kissed her goodbye in the mornings, a perfunctory brush of lips. He still asked if she needed anything from the store. He still acted on the surface as if things were normal. But Alara felt the shift, the subtle, chilling withdrawal. He stayed out later. His texts grew shorter. His eyes, once so bright when they looked at her, now seemed to skitter away, distracted, distant. At night, she lay awake, one hand on her belly, a silent promise to the life within, the other gripping her pillow so tightly her knuckles ached, trying to stifle the sobs that threatened to tear her apart. She still hoped, a foolish, stubborn little ember refusing to die. Maybe he was just scared. Maybe he'd come around. That morning, 6 months heavy with a life he'd disowned, Alara woke to a silence so absolute it was like the world had stopped breathing. No sound of running water from the bathroom. No soft footsteps on the worn wooden floor. No Daniel. No Marcus, mumbling as he chose his shirt for the day, only silence. Thick, strange, and so cold it made her pull the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. She turned to his side of the bed. Empty. His pillow still bore the faint indentation of his head, but the blanket was folded. Too neat, too perfect. Unnaturally neat. A stone dropped in her stomach. With an effort that seemed to drain every last ounce of her strength, she pushed herself up, her belly a heavy round weight beneath her thin nightgown. Every movement was an agony. Every step through the silent apartment felt like wading through ice water. The kitchen, quiet. The living room, still. The coffee mug he always used, the chipped blue one she'd bought him at a flea market, gone. Her chest tightened. "Marcus?" she called, her voice a thin, reedy sound. No answer. "Marcus," louder this time, a tremor of raw panic in her voice. Still nothing. She walked to the closet, her hand hesitating on the doorknob. Something inside, a small, terrified voice, whispered, "Don't open it." But she did. Empty, his entire side of the closet bare, his favorite gray hoodie gone. The small velvet box that had once held his grandfather's watch, now just an empty indentation on the shelf. His sneakers, usually kicked haphazardly under the bed, not there anymore. He had packed, he had left. But the worst part wasn't the missing things. It was the silence, the absolute, crushing silence. No goodbye. No note, save for that small, inexplicably present wooden bird charm on the nightstand. No reason. Just gone. Alara stood there, frozen, her hand clutching the doorframe as if it were the only thing holding her upright. And then she did fall. She sank to the floor, not screaming, not yelling, not even sobbing, just collapsing. As if every part of her, from her skin to her soul, had given up all at once. Her belly pushed forward, round and firm beneath her soft nightgown. The baby kicked, just a little, just once. A quiet nudge as if to say, "I'm here. We're here." She placed her hand on her stomach, and finally, the tears came. Not loud, shaking sobs, but silent, scalding tears that ran down her face, soaking the front of the worn cotton shirt Marcus had once said made her look like spring. Now, spring felt a million years away, a forgotten dream. She didn't know how long she stayed there, crumpled on the floor, the silence of the empty apartment pressing in. Minutes? An hour? She only noticed when the pale morning light outside the window shifted, painting long, accusing shadows across the room, and she hadn't moved. She whispered into the air, a single ragged word. "Why?" The wind, rattling the ill-fitting window pane, seemed to whisper back, but no human voice answered. That afternoon, Alara gathered the shattered fragments of her strength and forced herself to stand. Each step was heavy, as if the weight of the entire world was sitting squarely on her shoulders. She walked to the bathroom, stood before the smudged mirror, and stared at herself. Red-rimmed eyes, tear-streaked cheeks, lips trembling. It was the first time she truly saw a mother in the mirror. He had left her. But he hadn't taken everything. He couldn't. Echoes in an empty nursery. The weight of alone. The silence of the empty apartment didn't just press. It suffocated. Alara stared at her reflection, a wild-eyed stranger peering back from the smudged bathroom mirror. How could she possibly survive this? The question hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the too loud thud of her own heart. Survive? She had to. For the tiny, insistent life thrumming within her, a life Marcus had walked away from as easily as shrugging off a coat. The mirror showed a woman carved hollow by betrayal, her future an unreadable, terrifying map. Each tick of the clock in the hallway was a footstep of Marcus's, walking further and further away, leaving her in this echoing ruin. Days blurred into a watercolor wash of fear and nausea. Then, the inevitable. The sterile scent of antiseptic, the relentless, uncaring gleam of polished linoleum. The hospital's fluorescent lights hummed a cruel lullaby over Alara's solitude. A new life was tearing its way into the world from her body, and in her heart a gaping void pulsed where a partner, a hand to hold, a whispered encouragement should have been. The pain was a relentless, ripping tide, and with each wave, the stark reality of her isolation crashed harder. Nurses, efficient and detached, moved in and out, their voices softened by professionalism, but lacking the warmth she craved. Machines beeped, a rhythmic, indifferent chorus to her lonely labor. There was no Marcus to wipe her brow, to murmur reassurances, to share the sheer, terrifying wonder of it all. Just Alara, gripping the cold metal of the bed rails until her knuckles were white, her own choked sobs lost in the clinical air. And then, a cry. Not hers, but a raw, powerful wail that sliced through the pain and the solitude, a sound so full of fierce, untamed life, it was like the first sunrise after an endless night. Lily, her daughter. They laid the tiny, squirming bundle on her chest, and the world, for a breathless moment, tilted back into focus. Pure, unadulterated love, so potent it seared through the despair, a warm, living weight against her skin. But even as Alara's tears of agony morphed into tears of overwhelming emotion, the crushing reality waited, a shadow in the bright, sterile room. This perfect, helpless being was hers alone. The responsibility felt as immense and terrifying as the love. Bittersweet. Oh, so bittersweet. The transition from the sterile cocoon of the hospital to the harsh reality of new motherhood in their leaky third-floor apartment in a forgotten corner of Viridia was brutal. Exhaustion became her constant companion, a heavy cloak she could never shrug off. Days and nights bled into one another, punctuated by Lily's cries, the endless cycle of feeding, changing, and rocking. Sleep was a tattered remnant, snatched in fragmented minutes. The apartment itself seemed to mock her efforts. A persistent damp stain bloomed like a malevolent flower on the ceiling above Lily's second-hand crib. 2 of the 3 light bulbs in the main room had flickered out weeks ago, and replacing them felt like an extravagance she couldn't afford, with savings dwindling faster than water through cupped hands. Poverty wasn't just a word. It was the gnawing anxiety in her stomach, the chill that seeped through the ill-fitting window frames, the constant, wearying calculations of what she could do without. Finding work felt like trying to scale a glass mountain. Her resume, once a source of modest pride, now seemed to whisper of her vulnerabilities. Potential employers' eyes would flick to her still soft belly, then to the single telltale box on application forms: marital status. Sometimes the rejection was subtle, a polite, "We'll keep your application on file." Other times, it was a barely veiled judgment, a tightening of lips, a question about childcare arrangements that felt more like an accusation. "A single mother, you say? And the baby is how old?" one interviewer had asked, his tone implying she was already a liability. The montage of closed doors, of forced smiles that didn't reach in different eyes, played on a loop in her mind, eroding what little confidence remained. And through it all, her parents' voices echoed, sharp and unforgiving as shards of glass. "You made your bed, Alara. Now you must lie in it." The memory of that final devastating phone call before Lily's birth, their refusal to offer any comfort, any support, was a fresh wound she hadn't called since. Until Lily's fever. It started as a flush on Lily's usually pale cheeks, a fretful whimper that escalated into a weak, miserable cry. Her tiny body burned against Alara's touch. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's fatigue-numbed brain. The thermometer confirmed her fear. High. Too high. The dwindling dollars in her purse wouldn't stretch to a doctor's visit, let alone medicine. Swallowing her pride, her shame, her deep, aching resentment, Alara dialed her mother's number. Her hand trembled so violently she almost dropped the phone. "Mother, it's Alara." Silence. Then a sigh, cold as a winter wind. "What is it, Alara?" "Lily, my baby, she has a fever, a bad one. I don't have money for a doctor." Her voice cracked. The pause on the other end of the line was a chasm. Alara could almost hear the unspoken, "I told you so." "Well, Alara," her mother's voice finally came, devoid of warmth, laced with a weary resignation that cut deeper than anger. "These are the consequences of your choices. You wanted to be independent. This is what it looks like. I can't just fix this for you. We have our own lives." Not a question about Lily, not a word of concern, just that. Parental abandonment, a fresh layer of desolation. The click of the phone disconnecting was the sound of the last door slamming shut. Alara sank to the floor, Lily clutched to her chest, the silence of the dingy apartment amplifying her despair. How much could one person bear? It felt like a relentless siege, wave after wave of hardship battering her already weakened defenses. Hopelessness was a seductive whisper, promising an end to the struggle if she would just give in. But then Lily would stir, her small hand instinctively reaching for Alara, her soft breath a reminder of the fierce, unconditional love that was now the sole anchor in Alara's storm-tossed world. This tiny, innocent life depended on her. entirely. And for Lily, she had to fight. She had to. In those long, solitary hours when the weight of it all threatened to crush her, Alara would often find herself tracing the outline of the small wooden bird charm Marcus had left on the nightstand. It was a tangible piece of her shattered past, smooth and worn from his touch, or perhaps from the touch of others before him. A cheap trinket, probably, yet it was all that remained of him besides the child in her arms. What did it mean? Why this, of all things? Had he left it deliberately, a cryptic message? Or was it just an oversight, a forgotten belonging in his hasty, silent retreat? Its smooth, unyielding surface offered no answers, only more questions, deepening the mystery of the man who had fathered her child, and then vanished like a ghost. The solitude of her existence was a constant, heavy presence, the weight of a loan pressing down, and the bird charm, an enigma in her palm, seemed to symbolize all the unanswered whys. One particularly bleak evening, after Lily, exhausted from her lingering low-grade fever and a day of fretful crying, finally drifted into a fitful sleep, Alara sat on the edge of her lumpy mattress in the near dark. The two dead light bulbs cast long, dancing shadows from the single flickering one, making the small room feel even more oppressive. The unpaid bills, a mocking, crinkle-edged pile on the rickety kitchen table, seemed to grow larger with each passing day. She clutched the wooden bird charm, its familiar contours a strange comfort in the vast emptiness. A single tear, hot and slow, traced a familiar path down her cheek. Is this all there is? She thought, the despair a bitter taste in her mouth. A life of shadows and unrelenting struggle? Just her and Lily against the world? Then a faint, hesitant knock on the door sent a shiver of pure apprehension down her spine. It was late. Who could possibly be calling on them now? A crack of light, the unexpected kindness of strangers. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped against her ribs. Who could it be at this hour, in this forgotten tenement where shadows clung to the peeling paint and silence was usually broken only by the mournful creak of the building settling around her? Alara froze, her hand still clutching the worn wooden bird charm, the tear on her cheek growing cold. Was this it, then? The final descent into some new, unforeseen trouble? Her imagination, fueled by exhaustion and despair, conjured a dozen unwelcome scenarios. The landlord, finally fed up with her late rent? Or worse? She held her breath, Lily's soft sigh from the crib the only sound daring to disturb the thick apprehension. The knock came again, softer this time, hesitant, almost gentle. Just when the darkness threatened to swallow her whole, that hesitant knock on the door wasn't a prelude to further disaster, but an offer. Incongruously, almost surreally, wrapped in the warm, comforting scent of freshly baked bread. Alara, moving like a ghost, peered through the cracked spy hole. An older woman stood there, her face etched with fine lines that seemed to map a life of quiet observation, her eyes, even through the distorted glass, radiating a calm kindness. Mrs. Evelyn Hayes, from 2 floors down. They'd exchanged perhaps a dozen fleeting, polite nods in the hallway over the past few months, brief acknowledgments of shared space, nothing more. What could she possibly want? With trembling fingers, Alara unlatched the door, opening it a mere crack. Mrs. Hayes? The older woman offered a small, unassuming smile. In her hands she held a cloth-covered basket. Evening, Alara, dear. I hope I'm not disturbing you too much. Her voice was soft, like well-worn velvet. I was just baking a little something, and, well, I made too much, as usual. She lifted the basket slightly. Thought you and the little one might appreciate some fresh rolls. And I brought a bit of milk and some eggs. Sometimes it's hard to get out, I know. Alara stared, speechless. The aroma of warm yeast and something subtly sweet, was it cinnamon? Drifted into the stale air of her apartment, a scent so evocative of comfort, of normalcy, it was almost painful. Groceries. Not charity, not pity, but an offering. A moment of genuine human connection, unasked for, unexpected. It was overwhelming. Tears pricked at Alara's eyes again, but these were different, tinged with a bewildered gratitude. I don't know what to say, Alara stammered, her voice thick. Mrs. Hayes' smile didn't falter. She didn't pry, didn't ask the questions that Alara saw lurking in the eyes of so many others. Where was the father? How was she managing? Was she coping? Instead, she simply said, "No need to say anything, dear. Just enjoy." And then, As if sensing the crushing weight on Alara's shoulders, she added, her gaze softening with an almost maternal understanding. You know, Alara, if you ever need an hour or two to clear your head, perhaps try to look for some work, or just to breathe. I wouldn't mind watching little Lily for you. I'm home most days. My own are grown and flown, and an old woman gets lonely for the sound of a baby in the house. The offer hung in the air, a lifeline thrown into a raging sea. The sheer, unadulterated kindness of it left Alara reeling. To trust her precious Lily with someone she barely knew? And yet, the weariness in her bones, the desperate need for a single hour of respite, warred with her ingrained caution. That's incredibly kind of you, Mrs. Hayes. Thank you. She took the basket, the warmth of the rolls seeping through the cloth, a tangible comfort. This singular act, so simple yet so profound, was the first crack of light in what had felt like an impenetrable darkness. It didn't solve her problems. The rent was still due, the job hunt still a barren wasteland, but it chipped away at the thick wall of isolation Alara had unknowingly built around herself. It reminded her that the world wasn't entirely composed of cold shoulders and slammed doors. Other, smaller instances followed, like tiny, scattered wildflowers pushing through concrete. One afternoon, at the crowded, noisy free clinic where she'd taken Lily for a persistent cough, Alara sat slumped in a hard plastic chair, her stomach hollow with a hunger she'd ignored for too long. She'd given Lily her last biscuit that morning. An older woman sitting beside her, her face a mask of worry for her own ailing grandchild, silently reached into her worn handbag, pulled out a granola bar, and pressed it into Alara's hand with a brief, understanding nod. No words. Just the shared acknowledgement of need, of human frailty. Alara had wanted to weep. Then there was Dr. Ramirez, the young, tired-eyed doctor at the clinic. After gently examining Lily and reassuring Alara that the cough was minor, she'd paused, her gaze unexpectedly direct, full of a startling empathy. You know, Dr. Ramirez had said softly, her voice barely above the clinic's din, you're doing an impossible job, and you're doing it all by yourself. That's not just strength, Alara. That's courage. Don't ever forget that. Courage. Had anyone ever called her courageous before? Marcus had called her sweet, quiet, sometimes even malleable. Her parents called her a disappointment. But courageous? The word resonated, a small, warm ember in the cold furnace of her despair. These unexpected moments of kindness, these fleeting connections, they didn't magically transform her circumstances, but they did something almost as vital. They breathed a little air back into her suffocated hope. They made the solitude feel a fraction less absolute. Mrs. Hayes became a quiet, steady presence. She never overstepped, never offered unsolicited advice. But occasionally, a small bag of slightly bruised apples would appear outside Alara's door, or a gently used baby blanket, or a tiny knitted cardigan in a cheerful yellow. Just a little something Lily might like, she'd say with a self-deprecating shrug, if Alara managed to catch her. During their brief, infrequent chats, Mrs. Hayes would sometimes mention her own small bakery, the Sunrise Nook, tucked away on a side street a few blocks over. It's a struggle these days, keeping a small place like that afloat, she'd sigh, a wistful look in her kind eyes. Good, reliable help is so hard to find. People don't want to put in the hours for what little I can pay. She never said it directly, but Alara felt a subtle seed being planted, an unspoken question hanging in the air. In the quiet moments, when Lily napped and the apartment was still, Alara found herself drawn back to an old, forgotten habit. Sketching. She bought a cheap, lined notebook and a couple of pencils with the few coins Mrs. Hayes had pressed into her hand for a little treat for yourself. Her first drawings were hesitant, shaky. Lily's sleeping face, the pattern of cracks on her own ceiling, the wilting flower on the windowsill. Then a new image began to appear, recurring with an almost obsessive insistence, a distant lighthouse, stark and solitary against a stormy sky. Sometimes it was a detailed rendering, sometimes just a few evocative strokes. Why a lighthouse? She had no conscious memory of such a place, no particular fondness for the sea. Yet the image persisted, as if bubbling up from some deep, forgotten well within her. It felt like a memory she couldn't quite grasp, a beacon from a life she hadn't yet lived, or perhaps one she'd unknowingly left behind. It was a mystery, another piece of the fragmented puzzle of herself, alongside the little wooden bird charm she still kept tucked away. Hope, she was learning, could arrive in the most unexpected disguises. A warm roll, a shared granola bar, an empathetic word, the ghost of a lighthouse on a page. One afternoon, Mrs. Hayes found Alara looking particularly worn out. Dark circles like bruises under her eyes, her shoulders slumped with a weariness that went bone deep. Lily had been colicky all morning, and Alara hadn't slept more than an hour. Mrs. Hayes observed her for a moment, her expression unreadable, but for the ever-present kindness in her eyes. "Child," she said gently, her voice a soft balm, "you look like you're about to break in two. I could really use an extra pair of hands at the Sunrise Nook tomorrow just for a few hours. Sweeping up, maybe wiping down tables. It's not much, I know, and the pay is, well, it's what I can manage, but it's warm and there's always fresh bread." She didn't press, didn't push, but her gaze was inviting, an open door. Alara looked at Lily, now finally asleep in her arms, her face angelic in repose. Then she looked at the kind woman who had, without fanfare, shown her more compassion than her own family. Could this be it? A fragile step forward out of the shadows? A chance, however small, to earn something, to feel useful again? Flour, dough, and a fading ghost, the scent of new beginnings. The question, gentle as it was, hung in the stale air of Alara's tiny apartment, a fragile possibility. A job? Even for a few hours? The thought sent a jolt, a mixture of terror and a desperate, unfamiliar flicker of, could it be hope? Alara looked from Mrs. Hayes's kind, expectant face to Lily, sleeping soundly in her arms, a small, warm weight that was both her greatest burden and her profoundest joy. To leave her, even for a short while, felt like a betrayal. But to stay mired in this suffocating poverty, this crushing despair, was that not a greater betrayal of Lily's future? Of her own? I'm not sure I'm up to much, Mrs. Hayes, she stammered, the words tasting like ash. It's been a while since she'd felt like a capable human being, she almost said. Mrs. Hayes simply nodded, her smile unwavering. Nonsense, child. A bit of sweeping, a friendly face for the early birds. That's all. Think on it. No pressure. She gave Lily's cheek a feather-light touch. She's a beautiful little thing. The next morning, Alara stood before the slightly battered, cheerfully painted door of the Sunrise Nook, Lily bundled securely in a sling Mrs. Hayes had magically produced the evening before. My granddaughter outgrew it years ago, just gathering dust. Her stomach churned. What was she doing? This was madness. She was a ghost of her former self, not fit for public interaction, let alone work. But the memory of Lily's trusting gaze, the thought of earning even a few dollars for milk and diapers, propelled her forward. She pushed open the door. The aroma of cinnamon and yeast felt like a forgotten language, Alara's soul instantly recognized. Could a simple apron be armor against her past? The warmth enveloped her, a stark contrast to the chill of her apartment and the iciness that had settled in her heart. The bakery was small, just a couple of mismatched tables, a glass counter displaying a modest array of pastries, and the glorious, hulking presence of two commercial ovens in the back. It smelled of comfort, of honest work, of beginnings. Mrs. Hayes, already bustling behind the counter in a flour-dusted apron, greeted her with a smile that reached her eyes. "Welcome, Alara, dear. Glad you decided to come." That first day was, as Alara had feared, overwhelming. Simple tasks felt monumental. Her hands, unaccustomed to anything beyond holding Lily or scrubbing dishes, trembled as she tried to arrange muffins on a tray. She fumbled with the till, her mind a blank when a customer asked for change. She was clumsy, awkward, a discordant note in the bakery's otherwise gentle rhythm. Each mistake, however small, sent a fresh wave of shame washing over her. The old voices, Marcus's dismissiveness, her parents' criticism, whispered in her ear, telling her she was useless, a failure. She was sure Mrs. Hayes would send her home before an hour was up. But Mrs. Hayes was a miracle of patience. When Alara dropped a tray of cookies, scattering them across the freshly swept floor, the older woman merely chuckled. "Well, now, looks like the floor angels are getting a treat today. Don't you worry your pretty head about it, dear. Happens to the best of us." Her guidance was gentle, her corrections offered with a quiet understanding that soothed Alara's frayed nerves. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a steady, unassuming kindness. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to shift within Alara. The rhythmic kneading of dough, the repetitive task of wiping down counters, The simple act of handing a warm loaf to a smiling customer, it was a balm. The warmth of the oven seeped into her chilled bones. The absence of expectation beyond doing her best was liberating. For a few hours, she wasn't just Lily's mother, the abandoned woman, the charity case. She was Alara, a person doing a job. And it felt good. A fragile, tentative good, but good nonetheless. A flicker of the girl who had once dreamed of owning a small, welcoming cafe stirred within her, a tiny ember refusing to be extinguished. As the days turned into weeks, Alara settled into a new, if still precarious, routine. Mrs. Hayes was an intuitive mentor, never pushing, always encouraging. She taught Alara the secrets of her sourdough starter, the precise way to crimp a pie crust, the art of coaxing a perfect bloom from a reluctant croissant. Alara, in turn, was a quick learner, her movements becoming more confident, her earlier clumsiness fading. She even started to enjoy the early morning quiet of the bakery, the shared cups of tea with Mrs. Hayes before the first customers arrived. There was one thing, however, that remained an unspoken enigma. A persistently locked door in the bakery's small back storage area. It was an ordinary-looking door, painted the same cheerful yellow as the rest of the bakery, but the old-fashioned brass lock was always secured. Mrs. Hayes never mentioned it, never went near it in Alara's presence, and an unspoken rule seemed to hang in the air. Don't ask. But Alara found herself inexplicably drawn to it. Sometimes, when she was alone in the back, fetching supplies, she'd pause before it, her fingers itching to test the lock. What secrets did it hold? Was it just old, forgotten stock, or something more personal? The mystery of it was a small, intriguing counterpoint to the otherwise open, comforting atmosphere of the Sunrise Nook. It was a tiny piece of Mrs. Hayes that remained tantalizingly out of reach. With a little money in her pocket, however meager, Alara felt a sliver of her old self returning. During her short breaks, or in the quiet evenings after Lily was asleep, she began to write again. Not stories, not yet. Just observations, snippets of feelings, fragments of conversations overheard in the bakery, scribbled into the same cheap notebook that held her increasingly detailed sketches of the mysterious lighthouse. She wrote about the way the early morning sun slanted through the bakery window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. She wrote about the rich, dark scent of roasting coffee beans, the satisfying heft of a perfectly proofed loaf. She described Lily's gummy smiles, the surprising strength in her tiny grip. And she wrote about Mrs. Hayes, her quiet resilience, the unexpected humor that would sometimes flash in her eyes, the way her hands, gnarled with age and work, moved with such practiced grace. Her writing, like her baking, started hesitantly, but gradually became more confident, the words flowing more easily, her unique voice beginning to emerge from the shadows. One blustery afternoon, a regular customer, a kindly older gentleman who always ordered a slice of apple pie and a black coffee, paused as Alara handed him his neatly boxed treat. He peered at the label she'd carefully handwritten. Mrs. Hayes's famous apple pie, the Sunrise Nook. My dear, he said, his eyes twinkling, you have an absolutely beautiful hand. Such elegant script. Tell me, are you by any chance a writer? The question, so unexpected, so direct, startled Alara. A writer? It was a forgotten identity, a dream she'd buried so deep she'd almost convinced herself it had never existed. Before Marcus, before Lily, before the world had tilted on its axis, she had filled notebooks with stories, poems, the quiet observations of a young woman trying to find her place. Now the very word felt like a foreign language. She flushed, suddenly self-conscious. I used to. A long time ago. The gentleman smiled. Ah, a dormant talent perhaps? Well, don't let it lie fallow for too long. The world always has room for another good story. Later that day, as they were closing up, Alara recounted the conversation to Mrs. Hayes, half expecting her to dismiss it. Instead, the older woman paused in her task of wiping down the counter, her expression thoughtful. A writer, eh? Mrs. Hayes mused, a soft smile playing on her lips. You know, Alara, that gentleman might be onto something. I've seen the little notebook you carry, seen the way your eyes light up when you're jotting things down. She met Alara's gaze, her own full of a surprising intensity. Don't let that voice go silent for too long, dear. The world needs more real stories, stories with heart, like yours. Mrs. Hayes's words, so simple, so validating, settled deep within Alara. Real stories. stories with heart. Maybe she did have one to tell. One evening, after a particularly fulfilling if tiring day at the bakery, after Lily was finally asleep, her small face peaceful in the dim light, Alara pulled out her notebook. She flipped past the lighthouse sketches, past the fragmented observations. She turned to a clean page. She picked up her pencil, not to sketch, but to write. She wrote a letter, not to anyone else, but to her past self. The scared, broken girl who had stood shattered by Marcus's betrayal. The girl who thought her life was over. She acknowledged the searing pain, the crushing loneliness, the bitter despair. But then she wrote about the unexpected strength she was discovering within herself, a resilience she never knew she possessed. She wrote about Lily's smile, about the scent of baking bread, about the quiet dignity of Mrs. Hayes. She wrote about the pinpricks of light that were beginning to pierce the darkness. As she finished, her eyes blurry with unshed tears, she looked at the small wooden bird charm lying on her nightstand, then at her latest, most detailed drawing of the solitary lighthouse. A strange sense of connection, a dawning, almost mystical realization, began to form within her. What if these weren't just random, disconnected fragments of her life? The lost love, the unexpected child, the enigmatic charm, the persistent, dreamlike image of a distant beacon. What if they were all pieces of a larger map, a hidden pattern leading her somewhere she couldn't yet comprehend? The thought sent a shiver, not of fear this time, but of a profound, unsettling curiosity. The lighthouse legacy, from crumbs to a cornerstone. That sense of a hidden pattern, of disparate threads beginning to weave themselves into an unseen tapestry, lingered with Alara long after she'd folded the letter to her past self and tucked it away. The wooden bird charm, once a symbol of sharp, fresh pain, now felt different in her palm. Less a reminder of what was lost, and more a question mark, a tiny, carved breadcrumb on an unknown trail. And the lighthouse? It continued to appear in her sketches with an almost willful persistence, its beam cutting through imagined storms, a steadfast sentinel on a rugged, unseen coast. What did it all mean? Was it simply her weary mind creating connections where none existed, a desperate attempt to find meaning in the chaos? Or was there truly a larger map unfolding, its landmarks obscured by mist, waiting for her to find the courage to explore? She thought she was just baking pies, she really did. But every crust she lovingly crimped, every sprinkle of cinnamon she dusted over fragrant apples, was a word in a story only she could write. A story that, unknown to her, was about to catch fire. The years, as they are wont to do, slipped by, not in a sudden rush, but in the steady, comforting rhythm of flower-dusted mornings and evenings scented with warm sugar and yeast. Lily, no longer a babe in arms, blossomed into a bright, inquisitive child, her laughter echoing through their small, now slightly less shabby, apartment like wind chimes. She was a whirlwind of scraped knees, paint-stained fingers, and endless questions, her spirit a vibrant testament to Alara's quiet, unwavering love. And Alara herself? She changed too. The haunted look in her eyes slowly receded, replaced by a weary but resilient strength. She became an indispensable part of the Sunrise Nook, her days a blur of kneading dough, icing cakes, charming customers with her gentle smile, and sharing quiet confidences with Mrs. Hayes. The bakery wasn't just a job anymore. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing, a cornerstone in the life she was painstakingly rebuilding, crumb by crumb. One sun-drenched afternoon, about 3 years after Alara had first stepped, trembling, into the bakery, Mrs. Hayes sat her down with a cup of chamomile tea and an uncharacteristically solemn expression. "Alara, my dear," she began, her voice a little shaky, "this old body isn't what it used to be. And this bakery, it needs younger hands, a fresher vision, to truly thrive." She paused, her gaze locking with Alara's. "It needs you." She then proposed a plan, a small loan, easily repayable from the bakery's earnings, for Alara to officially take over the Sunrise Nook. "It's always been your heart in this place, child, more than mine these last few years," Mrs. Hayes had said, a tear tracing a path through the flower on her cheek. "It's time you made it truly your own." And so Alara became the owner of the Sunrise Nook. She infused the little bakery with her own quiet warmth, her innate creativity blossoming. She introduced new recipes: lavender shortbread, cardamom buns, a dark chocolate and sea salt tart that had the locals swooning. But it was her apple pie, a variation on a half-remembered recipe from her own grandmother, elevated with a secret blend of spices and a crust so flaky it shattered at the touch, that became truly legendary. People came from neighboring towns, drawn by word-of-mouth whispers of Ilara's incredible apple pie. The little bell above the bakery door jingled more and more frequently. With a measure of financial stability, however modest, came a rekindling of another, almost forgotten passion. She wrote more. Tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. She started a small anonymous blog, sharing her little stories, poems that captured the fleeting beauty of a sunrise over Viridia, or the quiet heroism of everyday lives she observed. Her words, like her baking, were infused with a gentle honesty, an empathy that resonated with a small but devoted online following. She never wrote directly about Marcus or the depths of her earlier despair. Instead, she wrote about hope found in unexpected places, about the strength of the human spirit, about the comforting aroma of baking bread on a cold morning. Her lighthouse sketches still filled the margins of her notebooks, but now they were often accompanied by lines of verse, as if the image and the words were two halves of the same soulful expression. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the bakery was empty save for the two of them, Mrs. Hayes, who now came in only a few mornings a week to keep her hand in and share a cup of tea, led Ilara to the back storage area. She stopped before the persistently locked yellow door, the one that had always hummed with a quiet mystery. From a chain around her neck, hidden beneath her blouse, Mrs. Hayes produced a small, ornate brass key. "There's something I want to show you, dear," she said, her voice soft. "Something I should have shown you a long time ago, perhaps." With a click, the lock turned and Mrs. Hayes pushed open the door. Ilara gasped. Inside was not a dusty collection of forgotten stock, but a small, almost shrine-like room. Mementos. Faded photographs of a smiling young woman with eyes so like Mrs. Hayes's it was uncanny. A collection of delicate, pressed wildflowers in a heavy frame, a tiny pair of worn leather baby shoes, a bundle of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. "My daughter Clara," Mrs. Hayes whispered, her hand gently touching one of the photographs. "And her little one, taken from me too soon, a fever, just like your Lily had that time. And her husband, well, he wasn't strong enough for the grief. He just disappeared." Tears streamed down Mrs. Hayes's face, and Ilara, her own eyes blurring, reached out and took the older woman's hand. In that small, hidden room, surrounded by the ghosts of a past sorrow, their bond, already strong, deepened into something akin to family. Mrs. Hayes's story of loss, of resilience in the face of unimaginable pain, mirrored Ilara's own in ways that were both heartbreaking and profoundly comforting. She wasn't alone in her experience of abandonment and struggle. And here was Mrs. Hayes, a woman who had weathered her own devastating storm and emerged not unscathed, but whole, kind, capable of immense love. "This bakery," Mrs. Hayes continued, her voice regaining some of its customary steadiness. "Clara loved to bake. It was her dream, really. I just kept it going, for her." She then picked up an old leather-bound journal from a small shelf. "And this was her grandmother's, my mother's. It has an old family recipe for a special bread. A bread they used to make in the coastal town where I grew up, Port Blossom they call it, near a tall white lighthouse." Ilara's breath hitched. "A lighthouse?" Mrs. Hayes smiled, a knowing, gentle smile. "I've seen your drawings, dear. That lighthouse of yours, it looks remarkably like the one at Port Blossom. Perhaps it's just a coincidence, or perhaps—" She left the sentence unfinished, handing the journal to Ilara. "The recipe is in there. For a sourdough made with seawater and wild herbs, a taste of the coast. Maybe you could bring it back to life here. A legacy, of sorts." A legacy. The word echoed in Ilara's mind. That evening, as Lily worked diligently on a school project about local birds, she asked Ilara about the little wooden charm Marcus had left. "What kind of bird is it, Mama? Is it from around here?" On a whim, Ilara typed a description of the charm's unique, almost primitive carving style into her laptop search bar. Lily peered over her shoulder, intrigued. Page after page of generic bird carvings appeared. And then, a hit. A small, obscure online forum for collectors of folk art, a blurry photograph of a charm almost identical to hers. The post described it as the work of a reclusive, elderly artisan named Silas Blackwood, who lived in a tiny, remote coastal community called Seaview Cove. A village, the post mentioned, nestled in the shadow of the historic Port Blossom Lighthouse. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. Port Blossom, the lighthouse, the artisan, and Marcus? Could he have a connection to this place? Had he known of this artisan? Or was it all just destiny's call? An intricate, invisible web drawing her towards something unknown, something that felt both fated and terrifyingly uncertain. The convergence of the symbols, the lighthouse from her dreams and sketches, the mysterious bird charm, Mrs. Hayes's whispered memories, and the entrusted recipe was too potent to ignore. It felt like a new direction, a new map, its first tentative lines being drawn by an unseen hand, with Lily now a bright 7-year-old, curious about the world beyond Viridia, and Mrs. Hayes with a knowing twinkle in her eye, enthusiastically encouraging a research trip. Alara made a decision. She would go to Port Blossom. Ostensibly, it was to learn more about the unique bread recipe, to visit the source of its ingredients, to perhaps understand the legacy Mrs. Hayes had entrusted to her. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. It was a pilgrimage to the lighthouse of her persistent visions, a quest for answers about the enigmatic wooden bird charm, and perhaps, just perhaps, a journey to understand a fragment of Marcus's shadowed past, not for his sake, but for her own peace of mind. As she was in the midst of packing a small bag one busy Saturday morning, the bell above the Sunrise Nook's door jingled. A man stepped inside, his presence immediately distinct from the usual morning rush. He was well dressed, in a subtly expensive but understated way, his eyes, behind a pair of tortoise-shell glasses, sharp and observant as they scanned the bustling bakery. He moved with a quiet confidence, taking in the displays of golden-crusted pies, the plump muffins, the artfully arranged scones. He ordered a slice of her legendary apple pie and a black coffee, his gaze, Alara couldn't help but notice, lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary. Something about his focused attention sent an unfamiliar prickle of, not alarm, precisely, but a heightened awareness down her spine. The accidental icon. When a pie baked a legend. The prickle of awareness Alara felt as the well-dressed man lingered over his apple pie and coffee was an unfamiliar sensation. The Sunrise Nook was usually a haven of comfortable anonymity, a place where neighbors greeted each other and strangers quickly felt like friends. But this man, with his quiet intensity and eyes that seemed to absorb every detail, from the slightly mismatched vintage teacups to the way Alara tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, felt different. He wasn't just a customer. He was an observer. She was in the middle of explaining the day's specials to Mrs. Periwinkle, a sweet, elderly regular, her mind half on Lily's upcoming school play and half on the list of ingredients she needed to order, all while trying to ignore the man's unnervingly focused gaze. He finished his pie, every bite taken with a thoughtful deliberation that made Alara inexplicably nervous, then approached the counter. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a warm baritone that commanded attention without raising its volume. "That was, without a doubt, the finest apple pie I have had the pleasure of tasting in a great many years." Alara flushed, a familiar warmth spreading up her neck. "Oh, thank you. It's an old family recipe." Well, sort of. He didn't just buy a pie, he bought a story. And that rainy Monday, though Alara had no way of knowing it then, the unassuming man who introduced himself as Silas Thorne, a freelance journalist with a penchant for human interest stories, was about to make Alara, the quiet pie maker of Viridia, a household name, whether she was ready or not. Silas Thorne, it turned out, was far more than a freelance journalist. He was a renowned, deeply respected, though famously incognito, feature writer for American Spirit Monthly, a magazine with a circulation in the millions. Known for its in-depth profiles and evocative storytelling. He was captivated not just by Alara's pie, but by the palpable atmosphere of the Sunrise Nook. The genuine warmth, the sense of community, the quiet dignity of the woman behind the counter who seemed to pour her very soul into her baking. Over the next few days he returned, ostensibly for more pie, but his gentle, probing questions slowly coaxed Alara's story from her. Not the raw, painful details of Marcus's betrayal, those she kept locked away, too sacred and too sore for public consumption. But he drew out her journey as a mother, her struggles, her tentative steps into entrepreneurship, the quiet joy she found in creating something beautiful and nourishing with her own two hands, the unwavering support of Mrs. Hayes. He listened with an empathy that disarmed her, his notebook filling with her hesitant words. He made her feel seen. heard, important even. A week later, Alara was wiping down the counter after the morning rush when Mrs. Hayes bustled in, her eyes wide, clutching a copy of American Spirit Monthly. "Alara, child, you will not believe this." There, on the glossy cover, beneath a beautifully shot photograph of Alara, a shy smile gracing her lips as she held one of her golden-crusted apple pies, was the headline, "The Pie Maker of Viridia, a Recipe for Hope." The story, Silas Thorne's eloquent prose weaving a narrative of resilience, quiet courage, and the redemptive power of simple kindness and hard work, went viral almost overnight. The internet buzzed. Her little blog, once a quiet corner of the web, crashed from the sudden influx of visitors. The phone at the Sunrise Nook began to ring off the hook. National morning shows wanted to interview her. Publishers inquired about a cookbook, a memoir. Businessmen in sharp suits started appearing, talking about franchise opportunities, about turning the Sunrise Nook into a national chain. CEO. The word was whispered in hushed, speculative tones. Alara was utterly overwhelmed. The sudden glare of the media spotlight was blinding, terrifying. She, who had always preferred the quiet corners of life, was suddenly thrust onto a national stage. There were moments when she wanted to hide, to retreat back into the comforting anonymity of her small kitchen. But through it all, she handled the deluge with a quiet grace that only endeared her further to the public. In every interview, she was quick to credit Mrs. Hayes, her unwavering mentor, and the small, supportive community of Viridia that had embraced her and her little bakery. She spoke not of fortunes, but of finding fulfillment in her craft, of the simple joy of baking for others. During this whirlwind, with offers and opportunities flooding in, Alara felt an almost desperate need to ground herself, to reconnect with the quiet, internal compass that had guided her through so many storms. The trip to Port Blossom, the coastal town of Mrs. Hayes's childhood, and her own persistent lighthouse visions became more urgent than ever. With Lily, now wide-eyed at her mother's sudden fame, but more interested in the promise of seeing a real lighthouse and collecting seashells, and with Mrs. Hayes's tearful blessing, Alara set off. Port Blossom was everything her sketches had hinted at. A rugged, wind-swept coastline, cottages hunkered down against the elements, and there, standing tall and steadfast on a rocky promontory, was the lighthouse. Her lighthouse. Seeing it in person, so exactly as it had appeared in her mind's eye for all those years, sent a profound shiver down her spine. It felt less like a discovery and more like a homecoming. Following the thread from the online forum, Alara found Seaview Cove, a tiny, almost hidden hamlet further down the coast. And there, in a small, cluttered workshop, smelling of salt, wood smoke, and something wild and indefinable, she found Silas Blackwood, the reclusive artisan. He was an old man, his hands gnarled like ancient tree roots, his eyes the pale, faded blue of a winter sky. He didn't speak much, but when Alara showed him the wooden bird charm, he turned it over and over in his calloused fingers, a flicker of distant memory in his eyes. He'd finally rumbled, his voice like the shingle dragging on the shore. "I remember this one. Carved it nigh on 8, maybe 9 years ago." He squinted at Alara. "A young fellow bought it. Troubled, he was. Said he was running from a life he wasn't ready for," he said. "Never saw him again." Marcus. The description, vague as it was, fit. Alara felt not anger, not even the sharp sting of vindication she might once have craved, but a quiet, bittersweet pang of understanding. He hadn't been a monster, just a boy. A weak boy, scared of the weight of responsibility of a life he hadn't chosen. It wasn't an absolution, but it was a form of closure, a letting go of a different kind. Then, Mr. Blackwood had shuffled to an old sea chest in the corner of his workshop. "He left something else, that young fella," he said, pulling out a small, weathered tin box, its surface dulled with age and salt. Said if a woman with gentle eyes ever came asking about the bird, I was to give her this. Alara's hands trembled as she took the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, was a small collection of pressed wildflowers. The same kind that had grown in the meadow where she and Marcus had picnicked during those first, deceptively golden months of their courtship. And beneath them, a single faded photograph of Alara, taken on one of those sun-drenched afternoons, her head thrown back in laughter, her eyes sparkling with a joy she had almost forgotten she was capable of feeling. On the back of the photograph, in Marcus's familiar, slightly untidy scrawl, were 3 words. I wasn't strong enough. Be happy. A complex wave of emotions washed over Alara. Sadness for the lost boy he had been, a lingering ache for the shattered dream, but also, surprisingly, a profound sense of release. He had remembered. He had, in his own inadequate way, wished her well. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was something. A period at the end of a long, painful sentence. The trip to Port Blossom also allowed Alara to delve into Mrs. Hayes's mother's journal, to walk the same wine-swept cliffs where the wild herbs for the unique sourdough bread grew, to feel the sting of the salt spray that was, according to the old recipe, an essential ingredient. She experimented, her hands instinctively knowing how to coax the ancient starter back to life, how to balance the tang of the seawater with the earthiness of the herbs. And by the time she left Port Blossom, she had not only found a measure of peace regarding her past, but she had also perfected the unique, crusty, deeply flavorful bread, adding another signature item to the growing legend of the Sunrise Nook. Standing by the lighthouse, the vast, restless ocean stretching out before her, the wind whipping through her hair, Alara read Marcus's note one last time. Then, with a deep breath, she tore it into tiny pieces and let them scatter on the wind, watching as they danced out over the waves and disappeared. She still held the wooden bird charm in her hand, its smooth surface now imbued with a new meaning. It was no longer just a symbol of Marcus's abandonment or an unanswered question. It was a marker on a journey, a testament to her own resilience, a reminder that even in the deepest pain, unexpected paths could lead to unforeseen light. She was not just the pie maker of Viridia, the accidental icon whose story had captured a nation's heart. She was Alara, a woman who had faced her ghosts, a mother who had protected her child, an entrepreneur who was slowly, surely building an empire from the crumbs of a broken heart. She was becoming, in ways she was only just beginning to understand, the CEO of her own extraordinary life. But what, she wondered, as the lighthouse beams swept out over the darkening water, did this new life, this unasked-for fame, this hard-won peace, truly mean for her and for Lily? The sweetest slice. More than just a bakery. The wind that day at the Port Blossom Lighthouse carried more than just the scent of salt and the cries of gulls. It carried away the last lingering ghosts of Marcus, scattering them like the torn fragments of his final, inadequate note. As Alara stood there, the wooden bird charm warm in her palm, no longer a brand of pain but a smooth, comforting testament to a journey traversed, she felt a profound shift within her. The question that had hung in the salty air, what did this new life, this unexpected fame, this hard-won peace, truly mean for her and for Lily, began to find its answer not in the roar of the ocean, but in the quiet, steady beat of her own reclaimed heart. It wasn't about the burgeoning empire the Sunrise Nook was becoming, or the whispers of CEO that now sometimes followed her name. It was about something far simpler and infinitely more precious. They called her the $1 Million CEO, some, the apple pie angel, others whispered, their voices tinged with awe. Magazine articles chronicled her meteoric rise, television hosts marveled at her quiet grace under pressure. But Alara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her greatest success wasn't measured in dollars, or column inches, or franchise inquiries. It was measured in the quiet rhythm of a life reclaimed, in the unrestrained laughter of her daughter, in the peaceful, flower-dusted stillness of her own kitchen on a Sunday morning. 3 years later, the Sunrise Nook, against all odds, had indeed become a beloved national brand, its warm, inviting glow spreading to bustling city centers and quiet suburban towns alike. Yet, Alara had fiercely protected the heart of it all. The original little bakery in Viridia, with its slightly mismatched tables and the comforting aroma of cinnamon and yeast that had first welcomed her like a long-lost friend. It remained her touchstone, her sanctuary, a place where she could still be found on occasion, not as a distant corporate figurehead, but simply as Alara, her hands dusted with flour, a gentle smile for every customer who walked through the door. She was, by any conventional measure, a phenomenally successful businesswoman. But the sharp suits and boardrooms, the strategic plans and financial projections, they were just a framework. The true substance of her life remained firmly grounded in the simple, authentic values she had rediscovered in her darkest hours. Her home, A comfortable but by no means ostentatious house on a tree-lined street in Viridia was filled not with the trappings of wealth, but with the warmth of love, the scent of baking, and the vibrant chaos of Lily, now a bright, whip-smart 10-year-old with her mother's kind eyes and a spirit entirely her own. One sun-dappled Saturday afternoon, Alara and Lily were in their own spacious, light-filled kitchen, not the bustling commercial one of the Sunrise Nook, but the heart of their home. They were baking together, not for the business, not for deadlines or orders, but purely for joy. Flour dust their aprons, their noses, and Lily's giggles as she inexpertly tried to crimp the edges of a strawberry rhubarb pie. Mrs. Hayes, now a cherished, doting honorary grandmother to Lily, sat at the large wooden kitchen table, her hands, though gnarled with age, still deftly shelling peas, her eyes sparkling as she watched them. She was family, an unbreakable thread in the fabric of their lives. As Alara guided Lily's small hands, a wave of reflection washed over her. The journey, it had been a crucible. The searing pain of Marcus's abandonment, the gnawing despair of those early days, the countless rejections, the crushing weight of solitude. But then the pinpricks of light, Mrs. Hayes's unexpected kindness, the solidarity of a stranger in a clinic waiting room, Dr. Ramirez's validating words. The rediscovery of her own dormant passions, the solace of her sketches, the quiet power of her words. And then the astonishing, unlooked-for fame, a whirlwind that had threatened to sweep her off her feet, but had ultimately, paradoxically, anchored her more firmly to who she truly was. Success, she now understood, hadn't come from chasing it, not in the way the world often defined it. It had bloomed organically from the simple, authentic act of living, of creating, of pouring her heart into her craft and sharing it with others. It had grown from the decision, made in the depths of her despair, to not just survive, but to try, in some small way, to bake beauty back into a broken world. And now she used her unexpected platform, not for self-aggrandizement, but to give back. The Alara Vance Foundation, funded by a significant portion of the Sunrise Nook's profits, provided grants and mentorship for single mothers striving to start their own businesses, for aspiring female entrepreneurs who, like her, had a dream and the courage to pursue it against the odds. She understood their struggles, their quiet fears, their fierce determination. On her desk in her home office, amidst the clutter of business plans and recipe notes, sat the small wooden bird charm. It was no longer a symbol of a painful past, but a quiet reminder of resilience, of the unexpected ways life can guide you, of the importance of keeping your heart open even when it's been broken. And in Lily's bright, cheerful bedroom, framed and given pride of place, was one of Alara's earliest, most evocative sketches of the Port Blossom Lighthouse. A beacon of steadfastness, a symbol of hope that had unknowingly guided her mother through the storm. The final, sweetest slice of wisdom Alara had gleaned from her extraordinary journey was this: life is not about avoiding the storms. Storms will come, inevitably, for everyone. It's about learning to bake in the rain. It's about finding the strength in your own vulnerability, the resilience in your own quiet acts of showing up, day after day, even when your heart is aching. We cannot always control what happens to us, the unexpected betrayals, the devastating losses, the cruel twists of fate. But we can, as those ancient Stoic philosophers understood, always control how we respond. Alara's response had been to choose creation over despair, connection over isolation, hope over bitterness. She had kept showing up. She had kept creating. And so, dear friend, if today feels heavy for you, if the road ahead seems daunting and shrouded in mist, I want you to remember Alara. Remember the terror that gave way to a tiny, fierce love. Remember the kindness of strangers that became a lifeline. Remember the scent of cinnamon and yeast that signaled a new beginning. Life didn't hand her miracles on a silver platter. It handed her hardship, abandonment, and the very real possibility of being crushed by despair. But she met each challenge not with grand pronouncements or dramatic gestures, but with quiet courage, with the unwavering choice to simply keep putting one foot in front of the other, to keep baking her pies, to keep writing her truth. You may not see the reward yet. You may not hear the applause or feel the warmth of the spotlight, but like Alara, you are building something precious with every small act of resilience, with every moment you choose hope over fear. Even if it's just one pie, one page, one carefully tended garden, or one breath taken with intention. The world doesn't need you to be perfect. It doesn't need you to have all the answers. It just needs you to keep showing up, authentically, bravely, with all your beautiful imperfections. It needs your unique story. Because, as Alara discovered, sometimes the most extraordinary destinies are baked from the simplest, most honest ingredients, in the quiet, unassuming kitchens of everyday life. If Alara's journey from the brink of despair to unexpected triumph struck a chord with you, if her resilience sparked something in your own heart, don't keep that inspiration to yourself. Share this story. Talk about it. Let her courage be a beacon for someone else who might be navigating their own storm right now. You never know whose life you might touch, whose hope you might reignite. What piece of Alara's story resonated most with you? Drop a comment below. Let's build a community of strength and shared experience. And if you believe in the power of stories like these to uplift and empower, make sure you're following along for more. Because everyone has a story worth telling, and everyone deserves to find their own sunrise.